Hello and welcome to the last of our Ancient and Medieval World History video lectures. The theme of our course this semester has been Empire, and we've studied the rise and fall of a series of imperial states in human history. We've looked at the ancient Persians and the ancient Romans, the Arab Empire of the early Middle Ages, the Chinese empires of the Han and Tang dynasties, and the Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan. Today we're finishing our course by looking at Spanish empire building in the Americas at the beginning of the early modern period. We conventionally end the time frame we think of as the Middle Ages around the mid to late 1400s. By the 1500s, we're starting to see the hallmarks of the modern world in terms of new technologies, in terms of a rising world trade, Europe's age of exploration, and the foundations of what will become the European colonial movement. Spain is at the forefront of these, but Spain is one of a number of empires in the early 1500s that claim world leadership. They claim to be the greatest empire on earth, endowed by divine power with the right to lead mankind. We see these sorts of claims made by the Ming emperors of China, who are claiming the mandate of heaven in the early 1500s. We see these claims made by the sultans of Ottoman Turkey, who view themselves as religious as well as secular leaders of the human world, who have ambitions to try to conquer not only the Middle East, but Europe as well, and bring these under the power of a sultan and Caesar at Istanbul. And we see this in the monarchy of Spain, where Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon and their marriage alliance had turned Spain into a major European power. They've defeated their Muslim opponents on the Spanish peninsula and tried to drive both Islam and Judaism out of Spain in the 1490s, while funding the overseas explorations of Columbus that would lead to the beginnings of a Spanish empire that spanned the Atlantic Ocean. Now, in the early 1500s, the Spanish are going to expand on these foundations. They are going to take over not only the Caribbean islands, but of course they would engage in conquests in Mexico, in Peru, and other parts of South America that become key to Spain's wealth. By the later 1500s, treasure fleets from the Americas are sailing back to Spain and enriching the Spanish monarchy. Now, at the same time, the Spanish have engaged in imperial expansion in Europe as well. By the early 1500s, they're fighting the French for control of Italy and the wealth produced by the Renaissance Italian city-states. And the Spanish have ringed France in with a network of alliances in the Holy Roman Empire of Germany and in Tudor England. In both of those areas, daughters of Isabella and Ferdinand are married into the German and the English royal families in order to create this network of European monarchy that supports Spain's grand imperial ambitions and checks those of the French. Now, what we're going to think about in today's class is how Spain wields its power. Why is it able to take over the indigenous empires of Native American peoples in Mexico and in Peru? But ultimately, also, what are the limits of Spanish imperial power? The Spanish are going to find, as the Ottoman Turks do in the same period, that religious division within their community continues to emerge, continues to fragment the world that they are trying to dominate. Just as the Ottoman Turks would be unable to convince all within the Muslim world to accept their claim to worldwide power. Rivals would emerge in Shiite Persia in the early 1500s in the Persian Safavid dynasty, and in the new Mughal dynasty of India, Sunni Muslim dynasty that also claims to lead Muslims across the world. And in Spain's case, they're going to see the emergence of new breaks within Christianity, that just as Spain seems at the height of its power, emerge to check Spanish authority in Germany and in England, and then in general in Europe. So first of all, let's think about Spanish power in the Americas. How does this develop? One of the areas that we have not been able to devote time to in our course is the civilizations of the early Americas. I urge you, if you're interested in these, to take a look at the excellent introductory treatments of early Maya society, the early empire of Teotihuacan, the empires of early Peru and people such as the Moche. These are deserving of study in their own right, and it's unfortunate that we didn't have time within this semester to give them their due. However, at the period when the Spanish are muscling their way into the Caribbean region and starting to show a wider interest in the mainland of the Americas, you have two major powers in the American landscape that are going to encounter the Spanish conquistadors. These are, of course, the Mexica, more popularly known as the Aztecs, in Mexico, and the Inca Empire in Peru, especially in the region of the Andes Mountains, and then down towards the Pacific coast. In both of these Native American states, you have powers that are experimenting with empire themselves, that are building on a long tradition of Central American and South American imperial formations. But both the Mexica Aztecs and the Incas are in charge of empires that are a century old at the time of the Spanish conquest. And ultimately, they do not have the strong central bases that will allow them to successfully resist a Spanish invasion, despite the very, very small numbers of the early conquistadors. The Spanish crown had not orchestrated or directly planned the invasion and conquest of Mexico and Peru. The Spanish crown sends authorities to Cuba. It starts out building colonies in the Caribbean islands, and the explorations of the mainland develop as a result of private initiatives by people who are basically acting to enrich themselves with little authorization, sometimes actually outlawed by the Spanish colonial authorities. The classic case, of course, is that of Hernán Cortés and his conquest of Mexico, starting in 1519. Cortés essentially can be viewed as a sort of pirate figure, someone who acts without authorization. He organizes basically this group of 600 Spanish mercenaries to sail from Cuba in boats to the eastern coast of Mexico. They've already learned a great deal about the interior. They know of the existence of the Aztec Empire from their communications with local indigenous groups that are in touch with this inland imperial power. So Cortés and his 600 men land at Veracruz in Mexico. They move inland. They fight some skirmishes, but then very quickly make alliances with a number of local Central American groups, especially the people of a city-state called Tlaxcala. And with the support of these, they are introduced, they're given diplomatic contact with the ruler of the Mexica, Moctezuma II, and they're given a invitation to go to the great metropolis of Tenochtitlan, the island city on Lake Texcoco that is now the site of Mexico City. The lake is later filled in and covered by Mexico City's modern sprawl. Now, Cortés goes there in 1519. Why does he succeed with 600 men in managing to tackle and take over an Aztec empire that rules almost all of modern Mexico? How is this possible? We have this discrepancy in numbers, and early explanations for this, given by the conquistadors themselves, are often viewed with some suspicion by modern scholars who focus on this period. Cortez later issued self-serving accounts of the conquest in which he tried to portray himself as sort of a rugged adventurer hero. He made up a story that modern scholars believe to be entirely false, in which the Mexicas supposedly mistook him for one of their gods whose coming had been prophesied and therefore brought him to their capital. We now believe that that's not true at all, although this story has lasted in some pop culture perceptions of the conquest. Instead, what really seems to have happened is that the Aztec king does not take the conquistadors seriously because of their small numbers. He is aware of them. The Aztecs have intelligence about the arrival of this new outsider group with new technologies and trade goods in the Caribbean islands. They've had some early contacts with other Spanish landings on their shores. They're interested to learn more about them, but they believe that they're present in small numbers. They have prestige goods that might be of value to the royal family, and they're not necessarily seen as a threat until it's too late. Now, Cortez and his party are allowed into Mexico City. They're given audiences with Moctezuma, and essentially what happens is that they exploit this opportunity, and they take the Aztec king hostage at one of these audiences. They're in the middle of a city with more than 100,000 residents. The Aztec people rise up against these attackers who have seized their king and are holding him in one of his buildings and demanding gold in ransom for him. Aztec warriors attempt to storm the compound. Cortez claims after the fact that Moctezuma was tragically killed by his own men in the crossfire. Modern scholars are more likely to believe that the Spanish simply kill Moctezuma as the situation deteriorates. At this point, Spanish order breaks down, and the Aztecs drive Cortez and his followers out of Mexico City. Cortez himself is badly wounded. About half of the Spanish who had come with him are killed. The Spanish later referred to this event as La Triste Noche, the night, or La Triste Noche, the night of sorrows. So Spanish technology alone is not enough. And the Aztecs are not naive, and they don't believe that Cortez is some prophesied figure who they allow to come in and take their capital. Rather, they're taken surprise by this hostage situation that develops. They fight and they drive Cortez out and chase him back to the coast. What happened next, though, is the result of not only the death of the Aztec ruler. There's actually a smooth succession in Tenochtitlan, and a new ruler, Cuauhtemoc, comes to power. More importantly, the Aztec Empire is a short-lived tributary state. It, over the previous century, had conquered numerous surrounding Mexican city-states and had enforced unpopular taxes and human tributes on them. And essentially, the Aztec Empire it's a conquest state that has not yet fully consolidated its power. It has many outlying regions, such as the city of Tlaxcala, that would prefer to be independent from Aztec power. And what happens is when the Spanish reveal this vulnerability at the center of the Aztec state, the Aztecs' other Central American subjects revolt en masse. And the Tlaxcalans and others ally with Cortez. When he escapes to the coast, another group of Spanish forces from Cuba show up. They've been ordered by the governor of Cuba to track down Cortez and arrest him. And instead, in a remarkable act of con artistry, Cortez manages to convince these people not to arrest him and bring him back home to be executed, but instead to burn their boats and to march with him inland, join with Indian rebels against the Aztec regime, and take this city brimming over with gold. So they return to Tenochtitlan, they besiege it in 1520 and 1521. The vast majority of the forces in this siege are Indian or Native American forces, especially the army of Tlaxcala. But the Spanish are able to contribute some small cannon and other firearms, as well as some steel weaponry and some horses that play a role in certain parts of the fighting. Ultimately, it is this rebel alliance that overthrows the Aztec Empire. But Cortez and his opportunistic Spanish adventurers divide and conquer, and manage to take advantage of this alliance. In the long run, you see similar processes happening the following decade, in the early 1530s, when the conquistador Francisco Pizarro invades Peru with an even smaller force of less than 200 Spanish. There, the Inca Empire had ruled for about a century, had developed an impressive central government, a road system through the mountains, a tribute-based economy. But again, they had conquered subject groups that are restive and looking for their independence, and then had suffered a disastrous civil war, which weakened the Inca power just before the Spanish came. There's a similar situation in 1532, where Pizarro manages to approach the Inca court at a moment where the Inca king, Atahualpa, believes that he's having a meeting with the Spanish. The Spanish draw their weapons and attack and seize Atahualpa and take him hostage. And then, similarly to what happened in Mexico City, the Spanish in Peru murder the Inca ruler Atahualpa after extracting a ransom for him. Now, in both cases, of course, the final factor is massive infectious disease. The populations of the Americas, of course, have no immunity to diseases that the Spanish conquistadors have brought with them to the Caribbean, which have already started making their way through indigenous trade to the North American and South American mainland. Now, in the case of Mexico, the advent of European smallpox played a decisive role in cementing the Spanish conquest by slaughtering, decimating the Native American populations, including the people of Tlaxcala, who had helped to set up Cortez's victory. In the case of Mexico, this massive disease epidemic actually doesn't hit until 2 generations after Cortez and the initial conquest. There's this period where Mexico City surrenders. It keeps its leader, its Aztec king, Cuauhtemoc, basically becomes a tribute-paying ally of the Spanish. Over time, the Spanish government recognizes the financial opportunities and sends an actual governor and more officials to Mexico to take over from the early conquistadors and to set up a more permanent imperial government. And while that process is taking place, disease comes in and ravages the local populations and makes it easier for the Spanish to expand on and consolidate their control. In Peru, on the other hand, smallpox had actually preceded the Spanish there. The smallpox had come over from the Caribbean islands. It had decimated Inca society during the decade before the conquistadors showed up. And so in that case, the conquistadors show up and they find an Indian population, an Inca population, that is already badly weakened. And they then are able to take over its capital. Again, the Spanish government would then send over more soldiers and imperial authorities to start extracting tax revenue from the silver mines of Peru. So in both cases, Spain gains its American empire through exploitation of internal weaknesses, and infectious disease plays a major role in giving the Spanish the opportunity to bring the Americas into their claim to worldwide power. Now, at the same time, of course, Spain has its rivals. They're relatively peaceful in their coexistence with Portugal at this point. Portugal had fought a war against Spain in the 1470s, but again, then made the Treaty of Tordesillas with the Spanish in the 1490s. So by 1498, the Portuguese have sailed around the southern tip of Africa. They're continuing to expand the African slave trade, but they also now sail around and start establishing colonies on India's coast and trading with some of the powers of the Indian interior. In continental Europe, of course, the other great enemy of the Spanish are the emerging power of France. In 1503, Spain and France began what are called the Italian Wars, in which both powers are trying to control the city-states of Italy, trying to get the Pope on their side, and trying to set up a European empire. Now, the French in this period actually end up allying with the Ottoman Turks at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. Spain has this deep ideological commitment to a sort of crusader ethic of religious warfare, warfare against Islam and also the expulsion of Judaism from Spain. France, on the other hand, is emerging as a more pragmatic power. And basically, the French ally with the Muslim power of Turkey in order to try to check their enemies, the Spanish. So while France and Spain battle each other in Italy, and both sides deploy increasing numbers of the new military technology of cannons and then handheld arquebuses and pistols and other firearms, Spanish fleets are entering the Mediterranean Sea and battling Ottoman Turkish fleets, using cannons to blast each other on the water and to try to reduce each other's coastal harbors and fortresses. In alliance politics, Spanish power reaches its height in 1519. In that year, there is a sort of political merger between Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, that is the large-scale kingdom of Germany. There had been a marriage alliance between the two royal families there, and in 1519, a child of this marriage alliance comes to power as king in both Spain and Germany, as the Emperor and King Charles V. They're also allied with England, where the Spanish Princess Catherine of Aragon had married the heir to the English throne, Prince Arthur of England. When Arthur died, then she marries his younger brother, Prince Henry, who becomes the famous English king, Henry VIII. By 1519, it looks like Spain is in this dominant position. It's starting to win the wars against the French in Italy. It's gaining ground against the Ottoman Turkish powers in the Mediterranean. During the 1520s, the Spanish would finally manage to crush the French army and actually capture the King of France in battle in Italy in 1525. In 1529, Emperor Charles of Spain and Germany would manage to defeat the Ottoman Turkish armies when they tried to invade Central Europe and besiege the city of Vienna, Austria. But there is a new religious force emerging in Central Europe. And this would be where we get the new division within Christianity that is going to play a massive role in checking Spanish imperial power. The same year that Charles V becomes Emperor of Germany and King of Spain, the same year that Cortez lands in Mexico and begins Spain's overseas empire, in that same year, you have the emergence of Martin Luther as a figure of Europe-wide renown. Martin Luther, of course, this German monk calling for reform within the Catholic Church, is going to face the threat of arrest and execution by church authorities. Church authorities are closely connected to the royal family of Spain and now the Holy Roman Empire as well. The Spanish crown from Isabella and Ferdinand's time on had presented itself as the champion of militant Christianity. They had brought the Spanish Inquisition to Spain, and Charles V, therefore, throws his political weight behind the Catholic Church's efforts to silence Martin Luther's calls for reform. Charles V would actually demand that Martin Luther appear before him in his role as the Emperor of Germany and protector of the Church. At a meeting at the so-called Diet of Worms in Germany, Charles V would listen to Martin Luther, would demand that he recant his heretical views and his questioning of papal authority. Martin Luther famously refused to back down, even with the emperor telling him to. But then, when everyone expects that Charles V will use his secular power to have Luther arrested and executed, instead, Luther is kidnapped and smuggled out of the meeting to safety by a German prince, Frederick the Elector of Saxony, who is one of many regional German princes who hate the idea of political merger and unification with Spain. The Spanish, in other words, have overreached in trying to gain more and more political power across Europe. They have offended local powers that want to retain their own autonomy and independence. Many of the German princes fear the idea of being incorporated into this centralizing empire. And so Frederick of Saxony is sympathetic with Martin Luther's religious views, but also sees him as an opportunity to challenge Charles and to push back against this imperial power. So under the protection of the Elector of Saxony, Martin Luther is free to continue disseminating his teachings. Other new Protestant churches sprang up under the leadership of John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, and other reformers in Switzerland and in France. And by the middle of the 1500s, Europe is in the throes of a violent religious revolution that tears the Christian world or the Catholic world apart. You already have the schism between Orthodox Christians, who are now within the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and Roman Catholics. But now Catholicism is confronted by numerous emerging Protestant churches, which are sponsored by various local powers. And you get both rebellions against Spanish and German leadership, in which Protestants attempt to assert their rights of religious freedom. You also get civil wars, which tear the Kingdom of France apart in the later 1500s between French Catholics and the Huguenots, or French Protestants. And in England, King Henry VIII is the ardent champion and defender of the Roman Catholic Church until it tells him that he can't divorce his Spanish wife, Catherine of Aragon, the favorite aunt of Emperor Charles V, who has not given him the son that he needs to secure the throne. He can't marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn. So, once again, personal marriage politics also play a role. Henry, of course, divorces his Spanish wife, marries Anne Boleyn, and launches the English Reformation in order to try to assert his personal rights over the church as well as the state. Now, the ultimate outcome of all of this is a cycle of destructive warfare, the religious wars which devastate Europe through the second half of the 1500s and into the 1600s. And these are going to see the decline and eventual collapse of Spanish imperial power and the rise of England, the Netherlands, and the reemergence of France as powerful competitors. In the long run, all of the empires of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period are going to find their limitations in religious division or in competition with other powers or in both. Thank you for your attention this semester. I'm so sorry that we weren't able to continue our course in person and give you the full course experience that you deserve. I hope that you were able to learn from these video lectures and the resources that I provided on Scholar. I wish you the best of luck with your final exam and good health and safety in all the times to come.